Hey there, art nerds. So I am really excited about today's unbox and swatch. We're taking a look at this really pretty palette from Phoenix. We've already talked about Phoenix watercolors a couple of times, first on their own, and then we compared them to Cotman watercolors because there's some scuttlebutt that Cotman is white labeling from Phoenix. So these are Phoenix's Chinese watercolors. Phoenix is a Chinese company, so that can make it kind of confusing, but these are formulated to be more like Chinese watercolors. And the impression that I got from AliExpress is that these are really kind of like Gansai style watercolors. So I am super excited to take a look at these today. Hey there, art nerds. Today we're going to take a look at one of the prettiest watercolor palettes I've had the pleasure of checking out here on the channel. I've been trying to push my watercolor palette reviews towards prettier and prettier palettes because why should art supplies be ugly? And this one almost rivals how pretty some Chinese makeup brands are going with their packaging and products. So I am really excited to be taking a look at the Phoenixcolor 24 colors Chinese style watercolor paint set. This is a semi-dry, semi-solid cake set. There are 24 in here and they're from Phoenix, and we have taken a look at Phoenix before. So I'm really interested to see how these compare to their more Western Winsor & Newton-esque watercolors. It comes in this small but very pretty packaging. I was, for 24 paint set, I was expecting it to have a larger footprint, but it is so pretty and so cute. On the back, we have a look at the colors inside. Now, if you're not familiar with Chinese style watercolors, they are a bit more opaque than what you may be used to in terms of transparency. They're very similar to Gansai style watercolors, and there's something I've played with on the channel before with Marie's Chinese watercolors. Both they're kind of like economical brand and they're more professional brand. And I'll be sure to link all of this for you guys down in the description below. So even if you're not in the habit of checking the description, I really recommend you check it for this video. So it came from AliExpress, so it came the way a lot of AliExpress stuff comes. I've already kind of done that unpackaging haul video for you guys, so I can link that for y'all too. This came shrink wrap, and I just want to take a moment to just admire how pretty this palette is with the Phoenix and the chrysanthemums and the gold tones, and I love the color palette of this palette. It seriously looks like it could be a makeup palette. It is gorgeous. Gotta say, I was a bit surprised to see that the half pans, or they're not really half pans, they're cakes, are wrapped. So that'll give us something to do. I figured they would not be. Inside we have a postcard. On the other side is a line art. This is on watercolor paper. It does seem like when this is a cellulose watercolor paper, but it does seem like when printing it, they printed it on what we would normally think of as the back. Might not really matter though. And then there is a swatch card glued to the top. It does seem to be a cellulose watercolor paper, a lighter one, but it should be good enough for us to be able to get done what we want to get done. And it does have a magnetic closure, but not as strong as most of the makeup palettes that I've used. And I am going to compare this to makeup a lot because honestly, look at it. It looks like a makeup palette, and that's not a bad thing here on this channel. We are here for the aesthetic art supplies. Here's my order as well as the listing on AliExpress for the Phoenix Chinese watercolors. You guys can get kind of a feel for what I paid. I paid $24.35, and you can also get a feel for the listing and the kind of art that they showed with the listing, because often I use that as not the final judge of what a watercolor set might be used for, but definitely kind of an indication of what I think they want me to think the art might be used for. I'll link this for you guys down in the description below if you're just curious or if you would like to order your own set. But you guys can see from the AliExpress listing how pretty these are and why I might be tempted to give them a shot. At time of purchase, I paid $27.29 for this on AliExpress. I paid just shy under $30, including, I guess, shipping and fees. It is a little bit cheaper right now, so I will have a link for you guys down in the description. I don't have any affiliation with AliExpress or any of the sellers. I do not have any affiliation with Phoenix Watercolors. All opinions are my own, and they are based on more than 10 years of painting watercolor comics, particularly 7-inch Kara. 7-inch Kara is a watercolor web comic with an ADHD coded female main character. Tiny Kara discovers a huge family secret and sets out to discover the truth for herself. The first 2 volumes are in print, or you can read it at 7inchkara.com. I would also love it if you would check out my art and illustration on these following social media sites. So this isn't really part of the student grade showdown. I'm not really going to consider this as part of the student grade showdown because these are Chinese watercolors. And I don't just mean made in China. I mean meant to handle differently from the majority of the watercolors we've been reviewing in our student grade showdown. So I'm not going to really think about them or compare them or hold them to the same standard. I am going to be thinking about the Marie's watercolors that I've used. I don't have like a huge amount of experience with Chinese watercolor. I have a very little bit. It is very inspiring to me, but in Southeast Louisiana, we just don't have a lot of options to learn how to do that in a class or to even buy the materials for that. So unfortunately, I haven't really been able to broaden my horizons in that regard, but I am going to be thinking about the Marie's watercolors. I also have some traditional Korean watercolors that we're going to talk about much later on in another video. And I'm also probably going to be thinking about like Gansai style watercolors because I feel like Gansai and Chinese style watercolors tend to handle very similarly. So depending on how the swatching goes, I may be comparing these against some of the Gansai watercolors we've talked about here on the channel in the past. I will probably also be thinking about the Aowen watercolors from Paul Rubens, since those are more of kind of a poured cake style, sort of similar to this. And of course, I am going to be thinking about the Phoenix watercolors that we talked about a while back. So the way I see this review going is we're going to start by swatching on the lid here. Then we're going to move on and swatch on some Blick Studio cold press watercolor paper. And we're just gonna see where the night takes us. We may end up painting this, playing around with this, kind of depending on how the paints handle. I may decide to do a full field test with my own art. I'm not going to commit to anything right now because, as you guys can see, I have not had a chance to play with these yet, and my guess is as good as y'all's is, and I don't want to say we're going to do a bunch of stuff and then have to like retcon that. So one of the first things we need to do is we need to unwrap these cakes. So let's pull one out. I may have to grab a palette knife because they are in there good. And it is really in there. Okay, so they appear to be wrapped in a plastic. They are larger square cakes. On the exterior, it seems to have the light fast information, the opacity, the name, that is also probably the name, let me know, as well as the color number. There is also more information about this specific color on the back. Now, unfortunately, I don't know that this information is anywhere else, so I may have to hold on to it, because what I like to do, as you guys probably know, is I like to cut this off and then attach it to the back here. But these seem to be custom made pans. They are ridiculously cute. They're so cute. When I talk about aesthetic art supplies, this is the level y'all should be aspiring to. So I'm going to pull one more out, and then we're going to do this in time lapse. I've got bad news for me. This is actually a really poetic little description, and I've translated it, so I'll read it. So it says color description. Oh, it's so tiny. I sent it to myself on Discord, and it is way smaller than I thought. And I don't actually plan on reading these to you guys live. I'm going to have them in the description and then read them to you guys at some point in this video. But I wanted to share this one with you guys. So, color description. The feller color of goslings is also used as the color of clothing and fine wine. Color illusions. Maybe hairpin white flowers make clothes purple. Purple flowers make clothes. Goose yellow. Zhao Mi's wild words of Qidong Zhang Gongfu Haodong, or Haoduo. Sorry about that. So it's very charming, and that's why I wanted to share it with you guys. But it means I have to translate each one individually. So like I said, I'm going to unwrap them and then just read the translations to you guys probably through this time lapse. The colors in this palette are light yellow 001, which has 5 stars of light fastness and is transparent. Smoke Tree 002, which has 4 stars of light fastness and is semi-transparent. Apricot Yellow 003, which has 4 stars of light fastness and is transparent. Persimmon 004, which has 4 stars of light fastness and is transparent. Vermilion 005, which has 5 stars of light fastness and is semi-transparent. Blush 006, which has 4 stars of light fastness and is opaque. And just keep in mind that I'll have all this information for you guys in the show notes, so don't worry about trying to follow along with me verbally. The wrappers themselves are a little bit adhesive, so they take a little bit longer to peel off, but I can basically just stick them onto the backs of the half pans. In the next row, we have Red 007, which has 3 stars of light fastness and is opaque. We have Plum 008, which has 3 stars of light fastness and is semi-transparent. Pale Purple 009, which has 3 stars of light fastness and is semi-transparent. Ultramarine 010, which has 3 stars of light fastness and is semi-transparent. Indigo 011, which has 3 stars of light fastness and is semi-transparent. And Azure, which has 012, which has 3 stars of light fastness and is semi-transparent. In the third row, we have Peacock Feather 013, which has 3 stars of light fastness and is transparent. Pine Needles 014, which has 3 stars of light fastness and is transparent. Light Green 015, 3 stars of light fastness and semi-transparent. Pale Green Willows 016, which has 4 stars of light fastness and is semi-transparent. Autumn Colors 017, which has 3 stars of light fastness and is opaque. And Galois or Galois, which is 018, has 4 stars of light fastness and is semi-opaque. In the final row, we have Umber 019, which has 4 stars of light fastness and is opaque. Purple 020, which has 3 stars of light fastness and is opaque. Haze 021, which has 3 stars of light fastness and is semi-transparent. Black 022, which has 5 stars of light fastness and is opaque. Gold 023, with 3 stars of light fastness and is opaque. And Adrian White, which is 024, with 4 stars of light fastness and is opaque. Maybe it's the novelty, but I am already really charmed by this set. The pans are friction fit into the foam template, so if you want a travel safe setup, you may want to like tape them in, or you may want to tape your palette shut or hold it secure with a rubber band or two while in transit, because while it is magneted shut, I wouldn't trust that to stay shut in an airplane. So now I want to go ahead and do the swatches at the top of this palette. Since these are cake style watercolors, I'm not going to pre-activate them. They should activate fairly readily because, as you guys can see, they are semi-solid rather than fully dried out. I mentioned the poetry on the backs of the half pans. Google and I had some trouble with this. I did translate it. I will share that in the full show notes, but some of it is a little bit difficult to read. So rather than read all that here and stumble all over myself, I'm just going to include that in the show notes. I have the dual camera view set up for you guys so that you can see a couple of different angles on the swatching. Sometimes it can be difficult to get everything in the shot, and this can help a little bit. Maybe it's the novelty, but I'm already really charmed by this set. The pans friction fit into the foam template. If you want a safe travel setup, you either have to tape in your pans, tape your palette shut, or hold it closed with a rubber band or two while in transit. So my notes while swatching the lid, I did not pre-activate these. Almost all of these colors activate quickly with good color saturation. Gold is the exception, but since it's a new pan, it might just be acting strangely. Yes, gold does need some pre-activation, but then you can pick up a lot of it. These don't pollute the water too badly, and I'm looking forward to seeing how these swatch on Cottonrag paper. So far, these seem really promising, although there probably isn't a lot of paint in these, and they probably get used up fast. So far, I'm pretty impressed. Almost all of the colors activated quickly with good color saturation. Gold was kind of the only exception, but it's a new pan, and once I let the water just kind of sit on the pan, it really picked up a lot more gold. So I think you could do a thicker application of gold if you just give it a chance to absorb some of the water. These don't pollute the water too badly, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how these swatch on the Cottonrag paper. Like I said, these seem really promising, although there probably isn't a lot of paint in these, so they probably get used up pretty fast. That said, those half pans are super cute, so it might be worth your while to refill them as they get used up. So we're going to switch on over now to our Blick Studio Cottonrag watercolor paper. The magic of editing. And I am going to apply... Well, I may actually want to switch to a bigger sheet. Technically, I could get all 24 swatches on this, but it's going to be a little bit cramped. So let me just... All right, now we have a much larger, in fact, too large for our view area. So let me just... All right, there we go. So now we're all set up. I should have more than plenty of room to swatch on here. So what I'm going to do is I am going to use a Copic marker to lay down some lines so that we can test for opacity. We're also going to be looking at granulation and liftability in this part of our test. Swatching on Cottonrag paper, I noticed that the colors are very finely milled, but don't necessarily seem to be dye-based to me. They remind me of Japanese and Chinese watercolors. I was hoping for more granulation with 010, 014, 017, and 021, but it's fine. Colors aren't as opaque as I expected over the black line. None of them stand out as particularly opaque, and I was hoping that 002, 006, 016, 017, 023, and 024 would all have more opacity. The neutrals don't seem to be fake. They're a bit weak, but kind of in line with what Meiliang has. And I did pre-activate the gold a bit to give it a chance to shine. That said, though, I really like this format. I like the size, the layout, how quickly these activate, and I really like the shape of the pane openings. It makes it very easy to get a brush in from several different angles. The palette itself is cardboard, which is a little disappointing as it's going to be prone to water damage, and there's no protective sleeve between the pans and the lid, so you may wish to add a sheet of Yupo. There also isn't a mixing surface, which works for me because I generally prefer to provide my own. I think this could be a good set for painting and sketching at conventions or shows. Compact enough to travel well, the pans are wide enough to get at, but it doesn't take up a huge amount of space, and it's visually appealing, so it may attract the attention of customers, which can be helpful in selling commissions. It's a little difficult to get a bead on these watercolors. The colors themselves are finely milled, but they don't necessarily seem to be dye-based to me. They remind me of Japanese and Chinese watercolors. I was hoping for more granulation, particularly with 10, 14, 17, and 21. Those all seem like they would be more granulating kind of colors, but it's fine. The colors also aren't as opaque as I expected over our black opacity line. None of them stand out as particularly opaque, and I was hoping that 2, 6, 16, 17, 23 and 24 would all have more opacity because looking at the colors, they seem like they should. On the plus side though, there aren't a lot of, it doesn't seem like they're really leaning too heavily on optical brighteners for these because we have a lot of really dark mass tone colors that turn out to be pretty brilliant colors. I do think they're obviously using some. I mean, some of these colors would need that, especially if we're going with, say, Chinese watercolors where we would be working with the color itself a bit more thickly. We wouldn't necessarily be doing the same kind of blending techniques. We wouldn't be doing the same kind of layering techniques. So often Chinese watercolors are differently milled from their Western counterparts, and they often use a different kind of binder. The same goes for Gansai. I can't speak to Chinese watercolor off the top of my head. I think they have an alum-based binder though, but I'm probably wrong about that. However, I do know that with Japanese, they use nikuma, an animal hide glue, and I believe Korean watercolors are the same, so it would make sense to me if Chinese watercolors were using the same kind of binder. Now, I cannot say if these are using that kind of binder. I don't actually know. The information available online really didn't give me much of an idea about it, but I do think they're probably not using gum arabic or dextrose as a binder. The neutrals don't seem to be fake to me. They're a bit weak, but that's kind of in line with what Meiliang has. Pre-activating the gold gave it a bit more of a chance to shine. I was able to pick up a bit more of it, but it's still kind of weak. I wouldn't call it like comparable to like, say, a fine tech. So if you're really looking for like that wham metallic, I actually have a big overview of different metallic watercolors that should hopefully help you guys out, but fine tech is usually a really good way to go with that. That said, I really like this format. I like the size, I like the layout, I like how quickly these activate, and I really like the shape of the pan opening. It makes it very easy to get a brush in from several different angles. The palette itself is cardboard, which is a little disappointing as it's going to be prone to staining and water damage, and there's no protective sheet between the pans and the lid, so you may wish to add a sheet of Yupo just for some extra protection. There also isn't a mixing surface, which works for me because generally I prefer to provide my own. I think this could be a great set for painting and sketching at conventions or shows. It's compact enough to travel well, the pans are wide enough to actually get in at them, but it doesn't take up a huge amount of space, and it's visually appealing, so it may attract the attention of customers, which can be really helpful in selling commissions. I want to let these colors dry more before we do the lift test, so I'm going to do a little bit of color mixing. I will go ahead and caveat though that in general, Japanese Gansai style watercolors and Chinese watercolors are not really meant to be mixed a whole lot. So generally a palette like this would provide you with almost everything you would need. I'm just going rogue and doing my own thing, but I did want to point that out, that whether or not these can or cannot, that isn't any indication of whether or not they're useful as Chinese style watercolors. It's just an indication of can you cross the streams and use them for other types of watercolor as well. For our color mixing test, I'm going to go ahead and lay down the first row of colors for our optical mixing. Give those a chance to dry while we do our atomic mixing. On this paper, the colors go down fairly vibrant but dry very muted and desaturated. I do really like the color selection in this set and feel like they probably don't intend for you to do a whole lot of color mixing, but I wanted to try it out anyway. I don't happen to have any nice rice paper or silk paper, but this might work well as an Etegami set, and I do have some Etegami postcards. Honestly, I was a bit surprised at how quickly these dry and how light the mixes ended up being. For optical mixing, these layer okay. They might be a bit opaque for a lot of layering techniques. I would recommend not allowing water to really pool on these because then they get really soupy and you end up picking up more color than you want. So the mixing. Let's start by talking about the optical mixing. These layer okay. They might be a bit opaque for a lot of layering techniques. I would also recommend that you don't allow water to pool on these because they get really soupy and you end up picking up a lot more color than you need or you want, and that can just be really wasteful. And considering we don't have a lot of paint in these half pan, or I keep wanting to call them half pans, they're probably about the amount of paint in a half pan. Since we don't have a lot in there, you want to make it last. So for atomic mixing, on this paper, the colors went down fairly vibrant, but they dried very muted and desaturated. I really like the color selection in this set, and I feel like, again, like Gansai Watercolor, I feel like they probably don't intend for you to do a whole lot of color mixing, but I wanted to try it out anyway. I don't happen to have any nice rice paper or silk paper to try these out on, but these might work well as an Etegami watercolor set, and I do have some Etegami postcards. Honestly though, I'm a bit surprised at how quick these dried and how light the mixes ended up being. These swatches have had a chance to dry, so now I can do the lift test. And what I generally, with other types of watercolors, I'm looking for with the lift test is varying degrees of liftability. However, since these are Chinese watercolors and they have a different binder, and typically the binder for Chinese watercolors is not as prone to lifting and reworking, I'm actually looking for not much lifting at all for these. With the lift test, I noticed that these don't lift a whole lot. They're pretty staining / sticking, which is to be expected for a Chinese watercolor or a Gansai style watercolor that might utilize a different binder than what Western style watercolors use. So these lifted about what I expected. They don't lift a whole lot. They're pretty staining / sticking to the paper, which is to be expected with Chinese watercolors. Over here, we have the Chinese style Phoenix watercolors. And then over here, we have the Western style Phoenix watercolors. So these are the half pans that you might be more familiar with, kind of depending on where you live in the world. So as I talked about in my Cotman video, there is a lot of scuttlebutt that these are actually the Cotman watercolors that are currently on the market, that Cotman is white labeling Phoenix watercolors. And when I was reviewing one of the newer Cotman travel kits, I did a head-to-head swatch off, and boy, it sure looks like that might be the case. Now, one thing I'm noticing about this formulation of Phoenix is that So this is the same paper. I always use the Blick Studio paper for my swatches these days. These look a lot brighter than these. So what I wanted to do was do a head-to-head swatch off. Now, this is a 48 half pan palette. This is 24. So what I guess I need to do is try to be picky choosy and find the closest approximations so we can actually compare the colors in these sets. For the battle of the two phoenixes, we're going to start with the Chinese style watercolors. I did a select few, the ones most likely to be in both palettes. I intentionally left out colors that would be more unique to traditional Chinese palettes, as those are less likely to be in a Western palette. With the Western palette, which I've already reviewed here on the channel, I'm going for the closest match and I'm eyeballing it. These were the best guesses referencing the digital swatches. I do think the Chinese palette has some additional colors, even considering those I intentionally avoided because I thought they would be unique. I didn't add any additional water when swatching this time, as they were full strength as possible. Without adding much water, the colors are much more saturated, but they seem to fall apart quickly when water is added. Not necessarily in a dye-based way, but in a low tinting strength kind of way. So traditional Chinese watercolors use a gelatin binder as opposed to Western watercolors that use gum arabic. In order to liquefy this binder, the glue crystals must be soaked overnight and then hot water must be mixed in. This type of glue can also be used in Western style watercolors to prevent bleeding when wet mounting. And there are also vegan alternatives to this kind of glue if you guys are curious about that. Given how soluble the Chinese set is even in cold water, I don't think they're using this traditional glue binder and are probably using something closer to a Gansai binder. Although there are some different colors between the sets, the Western Phoenix watercolors handle very similarly to the Chinese style Phoenix watercolors. The main difference seems to be the format they're presented in. When I was selecting colors, I was really just kind of going for the closest visual match and eyeballing it. So these were best guesses, and I was referencing the digital swatches on the Western style Phoenix watercolors. I do think the Chinese palette has some additional colors, even considering I was intentionally avoiding the ones that seem particularly unique to a Chinese palette or particularly unique to this palette here. I didn't add any additional water when swatching these, so I didn't do like a wash test. So they were as full strength as possible. Without adding much water, the colors are much more saturated, but they do seem to fall apart quickly when water is added. That's not necessarily in a dye-based way, but in a low tinting strength sort of way. That kind of makes sense though with how Chinese watercolors are typically used. So traditional Chinese watercolors use a gelatin binder as opposed to Western watercolors that use gum arabic. And if you guys check the description and you check the show notes, I'll have links to all the sources that I'm referencing here. In order to liquefy this binder, the glue crystals must be soaked overnight in water and then hot water must be mixed in, which is obviously not what we were doing today. This type of glue can also be used to prevent Western style watercolors from bleeding when wet mounting. Now there are vegan alternatives available as well if you're looking for something that would be a little bit more animal friendly. Given how soluble the Chinese set is, even with cold water, I don't think they're using this traditional glue binder, and they're probably using something closer to what Gansai watercolor would be using. Although there were some different colors between the two sets, these were as best as I could eyeball it, and there's still some differences here. They don't look exactly one-to-one. The way Phoenix and Cotman looked one-to-one. The Western Phoenix watercolors handle very similarly to how the Chinese style Phoenix watercolors handle. The main difference seems to be the format that they are presented in. So, since we're talking about Chinese watercolor, let's pull out some other Chinese watercolors. Here's the listing for the Western style Phoenix watercolors on Amazon in case you guys are curious. This is where I ordered them from originally. but I could not find the Chinese style, and I could swear I'd seen the Chinese style on Amazon before. I did order mine on AliExpress, as you guys saw. As I mentioned earlier, I don't have a lot of experience with Chinese watercolors. I would love to change that, but they're kind of harder to find down here in Southeast Louisiana, and sometimes it can be challenging to find instructions and information in English that I'm able to understand since I don't have access to the instruction itself. So most of my experience with Chinese watercolors come from Marie's watercolors. You guys are probably familiar with Marie's watercolors. And a while back, I compared their nicer professional line against their economy line. Again, check the description below. I'll link everything. So typically you would work using Marie's specifically. You would work with these pretty much straight from the tube in little saucers and add just a little bit of water. So I wanted to break all the rules and do what I want and just generally make a nuisance of myself. So I tried drying them out in half pans. You guys can see they're a lot drier than what we're used to seeing with Western style watercolors. They have a different binder. They are typically ground differently, and they're not necessarily sifted the same way Western style watercolors are. In order to get different color gradations, those are different siftings for particle size. I am not, Blue Heron Arts does a really good job explaining all of this. Any information that I've gotten about Chinese watercolor probably came from Blue Heron Arts originally. So if you're interested, check that out. Now, according to Wet Canvas, you should never use Western style watercolors. I'm sorry, let me rewind. Chinese watercolors for Western style illustration. But when people on Wet Canvas tell me not to do something, I usually want to run in the opposite direction and do what I want. So I actually have a video where I tried it out. I tried reconstituting these, mixing the colors that I needed for this, etc. on Blick Studio Cottonrag watercolor paper because I do what I want. So I don't have a lot of experience with Chinese watercolor in the way it is intended to be used. I would love to take classes and learn how to do that, especially because it is so brushwork reliant, and that's an area I'm still weak in. But I do have a little bit of experience with these paints, especially as I've been researching Gansai style paints. So the Marie's, I had fun with these. These are the professional ones. They are not as expensive as many comparable in quality, I would say, Western watercolors, and they have different properties. They have a different way of being handled. I would really recommend limiting how much mixing you do and how much layering you do, because where they really shine is kind of like the very direct and immediate painting where you have a color and maybe you blend it out a bit. So where they really shine is closest to what they're intended to do. Here are the listings on Amazon for Marie's Chinese watercolors, as well as some other watercolors that are kind of lumped under the Chinese watercolor category. This is an area I would love to be able to explore more under the guidance of a teacher. Obviously, Marie's isn't the only game in town. It's just often the easiest thing to get in the US. Winsor & Newton also makes Chinese watercolors. These are watercolors intended for their Chinese market, made in China, using processes that would be typically used for Chinese watercolor. I really want to do a head-to-head comparison against Winsor & Newton's Chinese watercolors and their Western watercolors to see how they differ and to demonstrate that. And I think I got these on AliExpress like a million years ago, but I wanted to show them to you guys because this is all a big work in progress that's taking me a million years to finish. Still on the topic of Chinese watercolors, Paul Rubens, which is a Chinese watercolor company that makes a lot of more Western style watercolors, they also have a more traditional set that I look forward to someday getting around to. If you've been using Holbein for a while, this isn't Chinese, but it is Japanese, and they're very similar. Their Iridori line, which is kind of their antique colors line, is very reminiscent of Chinese style watercolors, a lot of the same sort of colors. I thought it was a beautiful line. I think it's been discontinued, but I still have some tubes from that knocking about, and I carefully parcel out those colors, but that's more like a Gansai style painting and paint style. There we go. Sorry. And then Shin also has some Korean, like traditional Korean watercolors, and that is actually what this glue is all about. Now, I've talked about Shin a few times. I first found out about them because of their alcohol markers, but I use their PWC watercolors pretty regularly. These are supposed to be formulated a little bit differently, but I wanted to show this to you guys since we're on this topic anyway, and also to give you guys something to look forward to if you're interested in art supplies from around the world, like I'm interested in art supplies from around the world. Now, earlier on, I believe I brought up Gansai style watercolors. So these would be traditional Japanese watercolors. And what we call Gansai watercolors now, those are really more of like a ready mix, like ready to go, really well designed for Etegami postcards, which I've talked about here on the channel. There's several brands that make Gansai style watercolors. I do not know where my Kuretake Gansai Tambi watercolors are right now. We have moved several times since I last had them accessible, so I went digging for them, but I couldn't quite find them. I've talked about them a lot on the channel. I will link them in the description. I did, however, grab, I think this is either Akashia or Boku Undo, so similar, but not quite the same. Actually, now that I look at these, I think they're the Akashia ones. I do have some Boku Undo ones as well. I can't find those. Those are probably living with my Gansai Tambi. So I brought this up because, as you guys can see, just from a quick ocular pat down, they're pretty similar, if a lot larger, than the Phoenix Chinese watercolors. We have a similar color palette with the addition of gold and silver. We have a similar, there's like a glossiness to it. So with Gansai, according to Kimberly Crick, modern Kuretake Gansai Tambi watercolors include an animal glycerin instead of the traditional hide glue, which would be similar to the traditional Chinese watercolor hide glue, where you kind of have to mix it. There's a lot of videos on YouTube of traditional Japanese and traditional Chinese painting. If you're curious, I highly recommend you check them out. It's beautiful and interesting to watch. So without further information from Phoenix and from most of these companies, if you read the article I linked from Kimberly Crick, which I will link in the description, some of these companies are really very not forthcoming, to the point of being downright dishonest about what they're using to make their art supplies. So there's a lot of digging involved, and often as artists and art supply reviewers, we really have to go with our own research and our own experience and our own best guesses. So without further information from Phoenix or Akashia, I can assume that these cake-style Gansai-esque watercolors are most likely doing the same, i.e. using an animal glycerin for this. So now that we've talked about similar types of watercolor, let's talk about some other watercolor palettes that you guys might enjoy. These are really not super expensive. The only thing is they're a little bit challenging to find. As I showed you guys, I couldn't really find them on Amazon. I thought I saw them on Amazon, and then I couldn't find them on Amazon, which is kind of weird because I bought the first Phoenix set on Amazon. But let us start with, you guys know what this is. It almost needs no introduction, but if you're new here, hi, hello, welcome. I'm Becca Hilburn. This is the Superior folding screen style palette, and I selected this because it really reminds me of a Japanese Gansai watercolor palette in terms of the colors and in terms of the layout and how it's accessed, how it's used. So we have a lot of pastels in this, which is sort of similar to this here, maybe even more pastels, but this set here has, well, I lost the sticker, but I think it's got like 56 colors in it. But this is made by Superior, which is also a Chinese watercolor brand. They have really thin little chiclets. This is a really common style for their student grade. What I like about this set in particular is that these chiclets can be removed and replaced at will. Very similar actually to this set over here. And the whole set itself is plastic. It's sold as a travel watercolor set, and it does have a ring, but it can't really support itself. As you guys, if you watch the unboxing swatch and the field test for this, you'll see that. But I really like this palette. I think it's a nifty palette that's doing something a little bit unusual in a world where so many watercolor supplies are basically the same. We also have the O.Win watercolor cake palette. This is made by Rubens. You may also see it as Aowen. This one is also a cake style. So very, very, very similar in terms of format to the Phoenix watercolors. The main difference is the color selection feels more like a Western watercolor selection, more like the Western style Phoenix watercolors than the selection here, which has more pastels or more opaque colors or even a gold. This one is kind of more of a straightforward mixing set. And of course, I've reviewed this one for you guys. Make sure you check the description. I will have links for y'all. I will also have show notes where I talk about things more in depth. So if you're art supply nerdy like I am, the description is a good place to be. I have two more palettes that I want to talk about with you guys. We have the Rubens travel palette, and it is a very pretty little palette. But what I want to show you guys is that I feel in terms of format, it's very similar to the Phoenixcolors. Now, to me, this isn't necessarily like specifically for traditional Chinese watercolor or for Etegami style watercolor. To me, this feels like a botanicals set of colors. Almost everything has a much darker mass tone, so not a lot of optical brighteners. These colors, while they are designed to be used on their own, they can also be mixed to create some really brilliant mixes. I happen to just, this palette doesn't get a lot of use yet because it's still cold here in Louisiana, but I just really like it. I think it's neat. And I feel like the colors in this little palette are more saturated than the colors here, and they're about the same price point. I believe this is also a 24 half pan. I say half pan, it's not really half pan. This is probably very shallow little eyeshadow palettes, really. It's probably the same amount of paint in both of them. This one has a much smaller footprint, and I think the colors are a bit more saturated and more vibrant, so they may be a better fit for your watercolor needs and interests. And then we have the much lauded, talk about it all the time, Meiliang pigments. So this is the student grade of Rubens. Like I said, I have talked about this palette so much, so I don't really want to spend a lot of time talking about it. This is their 36 half pan set. I have seen the price for this all over the place, from under $20 to I paid $45 at my local brick and mortar. It isn't as, like, the liner is a really cheap plastic liner. You can't move the pans around, but it's very similar to its not student grade, it's professional grade older sibling, in that the colors are really bright and vibrant. I was really pleased with this set when I did the field test because the colors mix really well. I basically forgot I was doing a field test and I just enjoyed painting, which is really high praise for me. So I would say, oh, and it also activates very quickly. I would say that of the two, if I were recommending just a watercolor palette, not specifically Chinese style, I would recommend the Meiliang pigments. It's easier to find. You can find it on Amazon. You can find it at AliExpress. You can find it sometimes in a local brick and mortar. The colors are brighter. They're more saturated. I think you get more paint out of this palette. And it's a metal palette, so when you use this up, you can yank that liner out and put half pans in this thing, which is not what you can't do that with this. This isn't that sturdy. I also appreciate that it doesn't take up a whole, it does take up more space, but it doesn't take up like a lot more space. And you do have the mixing areas, which you don't have with this one, since this one feels very makeup inspired. Since this palette is fairly different from what I've been reviewing in the Student Grade Showdown, I don't really want to just leave it at this. So I decided it would be fun to do an Etegami watercolor illustration with you guys, a postcard, and that'll give me a chance to kind of play around with these and see how I feel about them. I may decide to do a Western style illustration field test later on. Hopefully you guys will keep an eye out for that. But I feel like this is probably more along the lines of what these are designed for, keeping in mind the materials that I have on hand. For the mini field test, I'm using some of Kuratake's Etegami watercolor paper. I've tried out a bunch of different Etegami postcards, and I've shared the results here on the channel. So if you're looking for which postcard is a good fit for you and your needs, hopefully I've got you covered. I'm going to go ahead and use some artist tape to tape it down just so that it doesn't buckle and curl all over the place. And I'm doing an illustration of camellias based on some photos that I took earlier this year. So I'm sketching them in very lightly with pencil, and I'm so sorry that you guys can't see them. So these handle a lot like Etegami / Gansai watercolors. They also kind of remind me of the Mozart Komorebi watercolors that I like to use for Etegami. I like those because they handle like Gansai and have a smaller footprint than the Gansai Tambi, but these have an even smaller footprint. For small, immediate pieces that don't require much color mixing and benefit from watercolors that activate very quickly, this palette might be a really good fit. Since Gansai is painted more thickly, using these for Gansai will run through them very quickly. So this might not be the most economical option. It might just be a good size fit. But even with the Etegami style painted thickly on Etegami postcard paper, these dry pretty desaturated and weak, especially when compared to Gansai watercolors. And that, I think, is my biggest disappointment with these. They're just kind of desaturated, just kind of weak for this style of watercolor. You have a lot, so many options for Gansai and Chinese watercolors. And while these are fun and they're very cute and very aesthetic, if my YouTube channel was like Art Supply ASMR, these would be it. These would be super duper cute. They just don't handle as well as some of the other sets that might be a little bit easier for you to find or might be a little bit cheaper. I was a little bit disappointed with what I was able to accomplish with this illustration, and having done a fair amount of Etegami, I know what these paints and what this paper should be able to do. I have a good basis of comparison. It's one of the reasons I wanted to do a mini field test with these for you guys, is because I liked them so much that I didn't feel like it was really fair to walk away without field testing them a little bit. I've been burned in the past. Like, I really liked how the Rosa Galleria watercolor swatched, and then I was super disappointed in how they handled. And I really liked how the Mia Diamond watercolor palette handled in the unbox and swatch, and then it really burnt me in the field test. So I wanted to, since I like these so much, I wanted to quickly test them out and see if they would be worth your while all in one video, so that I'm not leaving you guys hanging, because honestly, I know a lot of people don't go back and watch the field test before they buy, and I can't really blame them for that either, because sometimes it takes me months to get to that. So it was important to me to be able to just kind of demonstrate how these paints handle for you guys. If you like the combined review and mini field test format, let me know in the comments. Well, that Etegami Fieldtest was a little bit underwhelming. The colors are just not what you would want to see if you were doing Chinese or Gansai style watercolor. So let's talk about the pros and cons of this beautiful little Phoenix Chinese watercolor palette. We're going to start on a high note. We're going to talk about the pros. It is a short list. It is fairly inexpensive. It is fairly compact, and I have to say it is super cute. It looks like it's straight out of Cardcaptor Sakura. So what about the cons? It's challenging to find this palette outside of AliExpress. The non-standard pan size, as you guys can see here, may be challenging to put in a palette that suits you better. The pans are actually kind of small and somewhat shallow, so you're going to run through the paint fast. I feel like these paints are not that saturated, especially compared to other Gansai and Chinese watercolor paints. And while the color selection is a bit different from the regular 48-piece half pan set, the 48 half pan set is a smidgen cheaper than the Chinese set, and they handle very similarly. So you may be happier getting the 48 piece set. And when I say cheaper, I mean per pan. I don't mean overall. The 48 piece set is like $45 on Amazon, whereas this is like $27 on AliExpress for 24 pans. So we're going by pan here. We're not necessarily going by like, you know, unit price cheaper. And these dry pretty desaturated for what they are. So all that said, what's my verdict? Initially, I was really charmed by this watercolor set, but that was mostly due to the packaging. It is very cute, and the paints themselves are fine for what they are, but there are better paints, both cake style like the O.Win and Gansai watercolors, and Chinese style. I feel like Marie's Professional are better saturated and are a better bang for your buck than this palette here. So unless you're on ArtTube or TikTok and you want to impress people with your super cute and aesthetic art supplies, I really cannot personally recommend the Phoenix watercolor palette. But if your opinion is different from mine, if you have a use case I haven't explored yet, or if I'm not handling these the way I should be handling them, please let me know in the comments below. Obviously, be gentle. We're all here to learn, but I feel like maybe I missed a beat with these, or I'm missing a trick. Or if you have tried these out yourself and you like them or you don't like them, let me know that as well. So I had high expectations and things kind of fell flat. So I was charmed, and I did actually put a sheet of Yupo in here to protect it. I was charmed by the style of the pans themselves. They are very cute. They are still very cute. This is very aesthetic art supplies, and it reminds me of some of the really beautiful Chinese makeup brands that I've been seeing on the market. Unfortunately, I didn't really feel like they swatched all that impressively. I was hoping for more opacity, although they do activate quickly. And then when I pitted them head to head against their Western style counterparts, and the Western Phoenix is up here and the Chinese Phoenix is down here, I felt like they handle pretty much the same. I also did a small Etegami Fieldtest just because this is the closest I have to rice paper and the closest I have to how these are probably intended to be used. Although, to be real, the listing had a lot of anime art on it, so maybe I could have just done my thing. But I was really just kind of disappointed by how dull some of the colors are, how many layers you have to do, and how you really can't get that kind of vibrance that you might want from a Gansai or a Chinese style or even a Western style watercolor. So while this palette is incredibly cute, it is very pretty. I like the color of it. I like the layout of it. My only real problem is the swatch cards at the top. It's on a cellulose paper, so it's not like the best approximation. And also, these are friction fit inside a foam palette. So I could see it kind of falling apart since it's watercolor and you're messing with water. I could see it kind of falling apart over time. So my recommendation would be to go with their Western Phoenix watercolors if you want to buy Phoenix watercolors, or check out some of the other student grade watercolors that we've talked about in our huge student grade showdown. We've been working on this project for over a year, and every time I feel like the end is in sight, I find more palettes that I squirreled away. So we're getting there. I'm so ready for it to be done because I can't wait to do a ranked tier list with you guys. If you liked what you saw from my art and you'd like to get a better feel of the kind of art that I make, I have a TikTok and I have an Instagram, and you can check me out on these social media sites here. I hope you guys found this review to be helpful, useful, and informative. Let me know what you thought of the Chinese style Phoenix watercolors down in the description below. Are you going to buy them anyway because they are just so cute and so aesthetic? Or are you going to save your money and buy something that you might be a little bit happier with? Let me know down below, and be sure to check out my Student Grade Showdown playlist. I will have that linked in the cards, and I will also have it linked in the description, as well as all of my show notes. I hope you guys have a wonderful day. I look forward to seeing you guys again soon. Bye guys!